I was only trying to drive past the gate at the end of the road when Evelyn Strickland stepped out in front of my truck, folded her arms, and looked at me the way people look at a stain on a white couch. She smiled without any warmth in it and asked which house I was delivering to, and when I told her I was just going home, she said that people like me had no business parking in front of a private community entrance. I didn't argue. I looked at the polished brass sign bolted to the stone pillar behind her, and I asked her one question. Are you certain this gate belongs to the association? 3 days later, her own attorney knew the answer, and by then it was far too late for her. If you enjoy watching an arrogant board president walk straight into a legal trap of her own making, stay with me all the way to the end because the paperwork does all the damage. My name is Donovan Reddick. I'm 48 years old, I'm a black man, and I live at 14 Old Mill Road, in a house my family has owned since long before anyone thought to carve the hill behind it into cul-de-sacs with names like Wisteria Court and Bellhaven Circle. For 19 years I managed infrastructure projects, which means I spent most of my working life reading plats, right-of-way maps, easement agreements, and survey drawings until the language of property stopped sounding like law and started sounding like ordinary conversation. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a surveyor. But I know what a meets and bounds description is, I know what an easement can and cannot do, and I know that the deed in a filing cabinet outranks the confidence in anybody's voice. That Thursday afternoon in late March, I was driving my Ford F-150, a truck old enough that the paint had gone chalky on the hood, coming back from the building supply store on Route 21 with 4 bundles of cedar fence pickets and a box of galvanized brackets in the bed. I had sawdust on my jeans and dirt in the creases of my knuckles. The road out to my place runs parallel to the main entrance of Briar Glen Estates for about 200 feet before it splits off toward my driveway, and there's a wide gravel apron on the outside of the gate where I've pulled over to check my load for as long as I've been driving. That's what I was doing. My tailgate strap had gone slack, and I stopped to tighten it. Evelyn Strickland was standing near the gate with 2 other members of her board, a man in a golf shirt and a woman holding a clipboard, and the moment my brake lights came on, she started walking toward me with the particular stride of somebody who has never once been told no. She was 52, silver blonde, dressed in cream linen and the kind of jewelry that doesn't make noise, and she stopped about 6 feet from my window and looked at my truck first, then my clothes, then my face, in that exact order. "Which house are you delivering to?" she asked. Not hello, not excuse me. She had already sorted me into a category before I opened my mouth, and everything that came after was just her defending the filing. "I'm not delivering anything," I said. "I'm going home." She glanced at the fence pickets in my bed and at the work gloves on my dashboard, and she gave me a small, tight smile that she probably believed was polite. "Your home is certainly not behind this gate," she said. The man in the golf shirt looked at his shoes. The woman with the clipboard wrote something down, which I noted, because people who write things down are building a record. And a record is a thing that can be used later by whoever reads it more carefully. "I never said it was," I told her. "My driveway is on the other side of that hedge line. I don't need to enter Briar Glen at all. I've never needed to." That should have ended it. Instead, she took one step closer and said the thing that changed the entire shape of my week. She said it the way a person says a fact, not an opinion, and she gestured away a person behind her at the whole assembly, the 2 stone pillars, the wrought iron arms, the electrical control box mounted on a concrete pad, the license plate camera on its galvanized post, and the carved wooden sign that read Briar Glen Private Community in gold leaf. All of it in her mind, hers. I sat there with my hand on the wheel, and I looked past her at that hardware for a long moment. I looked at the stone pillars, at the fence that ran from the western pillar out toward the drainage ditch, at the conduit trenched into the ground under the gravel, and I thought about a folder in my hallway closet, a green accordion folder with my father's handwriting on the tab, containing every document that had ever been recorded against my parcel going back to 1958. I thought about a phrase in one of those documents that I hadn't looked at in 11 years, and I felt something quiet and cold and patient settle in my chest. "Ma'am," I said, "have you ever actually looked at the survey for this gate?" She laughed, genuinely laughed, one short syllable of it, and she said, "I don't need to look at a map to know that the association owns its own front gate." I nodded once, said, "All right," pulled my truck back onto the road, and drove the 200 feet to my own driveway with both hands steady on the wheel. I want to be precise about my state of mind because it matters to everything that follows. I wasn't planning revenge. I was annoyed, and I was tired, and I have been spoken to that way enough times in my life that it registers less like a lightning strike and more like weather. What I was more than anything was curious. Because a woman had just told me with total certainty that she owned something, and I had a strong suspicion that she owned no part of it whatsoever, and in my experience certainty without documentation is the most expensive thing a person can carry. The envelope arrived the next afternoon. Creamstock Association letterhead embossed at the top, my name spelled correctly, hand-delivered to my mailbox rather than mailed, which told me somebody had walked it down my road personally. Inside was a single sheet titled Notice of Trespass Warning, and reading it was like watching somebody build a scaffold and then stand under it. The notice alleged 4 things: that I had parked a commercial appearance vehicle on association property, that I had obstructed the entrance gate area, creating a safety hazard for residents, that I had caused a nuisance and disturbance to the community, and my favorite, that I had engaged in threatening conduct toward the president of the board of directors during an interaction on the 26th of March. I read that last line 3 times, and I actually laughed out loud in my kitchen, alone, because I had said perhaps 40 words to that woman at a conversational volume from inside a truck, with my hands visible on the steering wheel the entire time, which is a habit I did not develop by accident. The notice closed by informing me that any further presence in the gate area would result in the association exercising its rights, including but not limited to towing at owner's expense and engaging private security. It was signed Evelyn Strickland, President, Briar Glen Estates Homeowners Association. I did what I have always done when someone makes a claim in writing. I asked them to support it. That evening I sent one email to the association's general address, copied to the property management company listed in the footer, and it was 4 sentences long. I acknowledged receipt of the notice. I stated that I am not a member of the association and hold no lot within it. I stated that I dispute the allegation regarding my conduct. And I asked politely for the parcel identification number and recorded instrument establishing the association's ownership of the land beneath and surrounding the western entrance gate. I got no answer, not that day, not the next. What I got instead on Saturday morning was Evelyn Strickland standing outside my fence in sunglasses while I was setting posts in my side yard. She didn't come through the gate. She stood on the far side of the rail like the wood might be contagious, and she waited until I straightened up and looked at her before she spoke. "Mr. Reddick," she said, and I noted that she had learned my name from somewhere. "You're trying to turn a very simple matter into a problem." I set my level down on the post cap. "I asked for a parcel number," I said. "That's not a problem, that's a question. Any title company could answer it in about 4 minutes." "I'm not going to do that." "Why not?" And here is where she said the sentence I would think about for weeks afterward, the sentence that told me exactly who I was dealing with. She lifted her chin slightly and said, "Because I don't have to justify association property to a man who doesn't even live in this community." She let that sit for a second, and then she added, softer, almost kindly, which made it worse, "I understand this may all seem unfair to you, but there are procedures here, and there are standards, and you're simply outside of them. I have spent 48 years learning when a conversation has stopped being a conversation, so I didn't argue." I told her to have a good afternoon. I watched her walk back down my road toward the gate, and then I went inside and got my phone, and I drove down to that gravel apron, and I spent 25 minutes photographing everything. The stone pillars from 4 angles, the bolt plates at their bases, the concrete pad under the electrical box with a tape measure laid across it, the camera post and the direction of its lens, the wooden sign and its footings, the conduit trench still visible as a seam of settled gravel running back toward the subdivision, the drainage ditch, the old fence line and the 2 rusted iron pins I had known about since I was a teenager sunk in the grass on either side of the road, which nobody in Briar Glen had ever seemed to notice at all. Then I went home, pulled the green accordion folder out of the hallway closet, cleared the kitchen table, and started reading. My house sits on what used to be the front corner of the Halstead farm, 400 and some acres of tobacco and pasture that got sold off in pieces starting in the 1970s. My father bought our piece in 1958. 6.5 acres with a 2-story frame house on it, and the deed he received described the property the old-fashioned way, in bearings and distances running from an iron pin at the intersection of 2 county roads. That kind of description doesn't care about anybody's landscaping. It's mathematics tied to physical monuments, and it survives everything. Briar Glen Estates was developed in 1996. The developer, a company called Marchand Land Group, assembled the bulk of the remaining Halstead acreage behind us and platted it into 222 lots. But they did not buy everything. My father wouldn't sell the front of our parcel because the front of our parcel is where the wellhead is and where the old lane runs, and so what Marchand ended up buying stopped short. What remained in our name was a strip roughly 1.7 acres in size, running along the frontage of the county road, narrow at the eastern end and widening out to about 90 feet deep at the western end. the western end being precisely where somebody would want to put an impressive entrance to a subdivision. Marchand needed to get cars across that strip, so in 1997 they negotiated with my father, and what they obtained was recorded at the Register of Deeds in Book 1142, page 388, and it is titled Grant of Access Easement. I read it 4 times that Saturday night with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. It granted a perpetual non-exclusive easement for ingress and egress by vehicular and pedestrian traffic, over and across a defined corridor 30 feet in width, the center line of which was described by bearing and distance from that same iron pin. It obligated the grantee to maintain the paved surface. It included a clause permitting utility lines within the no-order for the benefit of the development, and that was all it did. There was no grant of ownership. There was no fee simple conveyance. There was no language authorizing structures, improvements, signage, gatehouses, fencing, monumentation, or surveillance equipment anywhere inside or outside the corridor. An easement of ingress and egress is a right to pass. It is not a right to build. And then I found the second thing, and the second thing is the one that made my hands go still on the table. There was a 4th page in that same portion of the folder, a separate instrument typed on a different machine, dated the 14th of June, 2018. It was addressed to Briar Glen Estates Homeowners Association and signed by my father's sister Maureen, who held the property between my father's death and my taking it over. It was captioned Temporary License Agreement. It granted the association a revocable license for a term of 24 months to maintain the existing entrance improvements in their present location, while the association identified and prepared an alternative gate location wholly within association-owned property. It stated that the license conferred no ownership interest, created no easement, and would expire automatically. It required the association to remove or relocate the improvements at its own expense on or before expiration. 24 months from June of 2018, the license had died in June of 2020. It was now the spring of 2026, and the gate had not moved 1 inch. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. I want to be honest about that moment. It would have been very easy to feel triumphant, and I did feel something, but mostly what I felt was a kind of weary recognition. Because that piece of paper meant that for 6 years, Briar Glen Estates had been maintaining thousands of dollars of hardware on land they had explicitly acknowledged in writing was not theirs, and in all that time nobody had checked, and the current president had been so untroubled by the question that she'd sent the actual owner a trespass warning for standing near it. Still, documents are one thing and dirt is another. Old descriptions can be ambiguous, monuments get moved, and I had a rough idea from satellite imagery that the gate appeared to sit well outside the 30-foot corridor, but appearance is not evidence, and I have watched too many people humiliate themselves by acting on a hunch. So on Monday morning I called Corbin Land Surveying and asked for Miles Corbin, who had done boundary work on a bridge project I ran in 2014 and who had the useful quality of being nearly impossible to make say anything he wasn't sure of. I explained the situation on the phone. I told him about the deed, the easement, the license, the pillars. When I finished, there was a pause, and then Miles said, "Send me the recorded instruments and the old plat. I'll pull the county records myself. But I'm not telling you anything about where that boundary runs until I've got instruments on the ground and I've recovered the monuments." "That's exactly what I want," I said. "People never want that," he said. "They want me to agree with them," and he hung up. Before Miles could get out there, Evelyn made her second mistake, and it was considerably larger than her first. On Wednesday, I received a second letter from the association, this one an invitation, though it read more like a summons. It informed me that the board would be addressing the matter of unauthorized activity at the western entrance at its regular monthly meeting on Thursday evening at the Briar Glen Clubhouse, and that I was permitted to attend to respond to the concerns raised. Permitted. I understood immediately what was happening. She wasn't inviting me to be heard. She was inviting me to be exhibited. She was going to stand me up in front of her community as an example of the sort of outside element that made gates necessary in the first place, and she was going to do it before I had any survey in hand, because in her mind there was nothing to survey. I went. Of course I went. I wore a plain gray button-down and khakis, and I brought a manila envelope, and I sat in the back row of a room with about 30 residents in it, under fluorescent lights, next to a table with a coffee urn and a plate of grocery store cookies. The board sat at a long table at the front, Evelyn in the center, a treasurer named Rick Doyle on her left, and on her right a woman in her 60s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, whom I later learned was Diane Foster, the vice president. They ran through the ordinary business first, a landscaping bid, a complaint about basketball hoops, a proposal to repaint the mailbox kiosks. Then Evelyn folded her hands and said, In a voice pitched for the room, the final item concerns an ongoing situation at the western entrance. We've had an individual repeatedly loitering at the gate and behaving in a manner that has made several residents uncomfortable. He's here tonight. And then she looked directly at me and said, "This is the man who's been causing the difficulty at the west gate." She did not say my name. I want you to understand that this was deliberate. Naming a person makes them a person. She wanted a category standing at the back of the room. So I stood up. "Good evening," I said. "My name is Donovan Reddick. I live at 14 Old Mill Road." Evelyn corrected me instantly, the way a teacher corrects a child's grammar. "That address is not in Briar Glen." "I know," I said. "I've never claimed it was. My family's owned it since 1958. Briar Glen was platted in 1996. Something shifted in the room then, small but real, a few people turning slightly in their chairs. Evelyn didn't feel it. She pressed forward and began enumerating, for the benefit of the residents, what the association owned at the western entrance, and she ticked it off on her fingers: the gate, the automated arms, the security camera system, the stone pillars, the Briar Glen monument sign, and the landscaped grounds surrounding all of it. "May I ask a question?" I said. "You may." "What's the parcel number?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The tax parcel identification number for the land under the gate," I said. "Every piece of ground in this county has one. Yours would be on the association's tax bill and on the recorded plat. I've asked for it twice in writing. I'm asking a third time in front of your members." She said, "I'm not going to be interrogated at my own meeting." Rick Doyle looked at her. Diane Foster wrote something on her legal pad and underlined it. A man near the window said quietly but audibly, "It's a fair question, Evelyn." And that was the moment she could have stopped. A more careful person would have said, "We'll look into it," and moved on, and the whole thing would have died in a filing cabinet. Instead, Evelyn Strickland leaned forward, and in the mildest possible tone she said, "Mr. Reddick, I think perhaps you're not familiar with how communities like ours operate." The room went quiet. Not shocked quiet, uncomfortable quiet. The quiet of 30 people who all heard the same thing and were each individually deciding whether they were going to pretend they hadn't. Somebody's chair creaked. The coffee urn gurgled. I let it sit for about 3 seconds because silence does work that shouting cannot. Then I said, "I'm very familiar with how real property ownership operates." I walked up the center aisle and I opened my manila envelope and I set a certified copy of my deed on the table in front of her. I didn't slam it down, I placed it. "That's the recorded deed to my parcels," I said. "Page 3 contains the boundary description. Your attorney may want to read it before this goes any further." Then I walked out and I did not look back, and I heard exactly nobody say anything until the clubhouse door swung shut behind me. Miles Corbin arrived at 7:40 on Monday morning with a white pickup, a total station, a GPS rover on a fiberglass rod, and a young assistant named Trevor who spoke about 11 words the entire day. Miles set up first at the County Road intersection, and I watched him spend the better part of an hour with a shovel and a metal detector before he found what he was looking for: the original iron pin from the 1958 survey buried 4 inches down under 6 decades of settled gravel and sod. He cleaned it off, photographed it, set the rover over it, and only then did he start working. Evelyn saw the survey truck at about 9:15. She came down the sidewalk from inside the subdivision at a pace just short of running, and she made straight for Miles, who was crouched over the tripod and did not look up. "You need to stop what you're doing," she said. "This is association property and you don't have permission to be on it." Miles finished his reading, wrote a number in a field book, and then straightened and looked at her with an expression of total professional neutrality. "Ma'am, are you the owner of record of this parcel?" "The association owns this area." "That's not what I asked," Miles said. "I asked if your name appears on the deed." "I'm the president of the Homeowners Association." "I understand," he said. "I'm working under a signed authorization from the record title holder, and I'm establishing the boundary described in a recorded instrument. If you believe the boundary runs elsewhere, you're entitled to retain your own licensed surveyor, and I'd be glad to share my field notes with him." Then he crouched back down. She stood there for a moment with nothing to push against, which I think genuinely disoriented her, and then she got on her phone and walked 20 feet away and started talking fast and low. The stakes went in over the next 3 hours. Miles used orange-capped rebar with orange flagging, and he set them one at a time, walking the line, checking, adjusting, checking again. I watched from the shoulder with my hands in my pockets, and I did not say a word to him the entire morning, because you do not talk to a surveyor while he is working unless you want to pay for it twice. The first stake went in 11 feet on the subdivision side of the eastern stone pillar, which is to say the pillar was on my side of it. The second went in behind the electrical control cabinet on the far side of the concrete pad, meaning the entire pad and cabinet stood within my parcel. The third went in past the camera post on the outside edge of its footing. And when Miles ran his string line from the first stake through to the last one, the line passed clean behind the wooden Briar Glen Private Community Monument sign, behind both stone pillars, behind the control box, behind the camera, and behind the ornamental fencing that wrapped around the entrance island. Every single piece of it sat on my land. All that ran through the area belonging to the association was the paved travel surface itself, the 30-foot corridor, exactly as described in 1997, and even that corridor, when Miles laid it out with a second set of stakes in blue, ran on a bearing that put the gate structures roughly 40 feet outside of it. The developer had never built where the easement said to build. They had built where it looked best from the road. Evelyn came back at 1 in the afternoon. She stood and looked at the orange stakes for a long time, walking slowly from one to the next like a woman reading headstones. Then she said, to nobody in particular but loudly enough, "He's obviously measured it wrong." Miles took a business card out of his shirt pocket and held it out. She didn't take it, so he set it on the hood of his truck. "That's my license number," he said. "It's verifiable through the state board. My field notes and my closure calculations will be part of the recorded plat. If a second surveyor recovers different monuments than I did, I'd want to know about it." He said it without a trace of defensiveness, which is the most devastating tone available to a human being. Then she turned to me. She had been avoiding looking at me all day, and now she looked, and her face had color in it for the first time. "Do you honestly think a few stakes in the dirt make you the owner of our gate?" "No," I said. "The stakes don't make me anything. The deed makes me the owner of the ground it's sitting on. The stakes just tell everybody where the ground is." The association's attorney called me on Wednesday. Graham Talbot was maybe 60, careful voice, the kind of lawyer who has learned that most disputes are caused by somebody's confidence exceeding their records. He requested a meeting at the management company's office and asked me to bring the survey and the deed. He was cool with me on the phone, formal to the point of coldness, and I understood why. He had been briefed by his client, and his client had told him that a non-resident was harassing the community and making baseless claims about association property. He wasn't hostile, he was working from bad inputs. The meeting was Thursday at 4, in a conference room with a laminate table and a whiteboard nobody had erased properly. Graham on one side with a legal pad, Evelyn beside him, still immaculate, still carrying herself like the outcome was a formality. Diane Foster at the end of the table silent, and me with a folder. Evelyn opened, and she opened badly. "The entrance has been in that location since before any of us were on the board," she said. "It's been maintained by the association for 30 years. At a certain point, that's simply how it is." Graham held up a hand without looking at her, took the recorded easement from my folder, and I watched him read. He was a fast reader, and his face didn't move much, but I saw the exact line where it changed because his pen stopped tapping. "Mrs. Strickland," he said, "who authorized the construction of the current gate assembly? There's a permit in the county file dated 2018 for the pillar and camera upgrade. The board authorized it. It was a budgeted capital improvement. It was voted on." "That's not my question," Graham said. "Who owned the land that gave permission for it to be built there?" Evelyn opened her mouth and then closed it. Nobody answered. Diane Foster looked up from the table for the first time. Graham went back to the easement and read the granting clause aloud, slowly. "Ingress and egress, over and across a corridor 30 feet in width. Maintenance of the paved surface." He set it down and said, mostly to himself, "There's no construction right in here at all." Then he looked at me. "Mister, has your family ever executed a license, a permission agreement, or any other instrument allowing these improvements?" "Yes," I said, "once." And I slid the last document across the table. He read the temporary license agreement twice. When he got to the expiration provision, he took his glasses off, which I have learned is what lawyers do instead of swearing. 24 months, he said, expired June of 2020, with an affirmative obligation on the association to relocate the improvements at its own cost. He looked up. "Mrs. Strickland, was this agreement known to the board?" "I've never seen that document in my life." "It's in your association's own files," I said. "It was signed by my aunt and the association's president at the time, and the association's copy would have gone into the corporate records. My aunt kept hers because that's what she did with paper." Graham turned in his chair and his voice changed. It got very quiet and very precise. "Miss Strickland, you told me the association owns this land." "I was told that by my predecessor when I took the chair," Evelyn said. "That's what I was given to understand." "Did you verify it?" "It didn't occur to me that it needed verifying." "You approved a capital expenditure of," he flipped a page, $28,000 for pillar work and a license plate recognition camera on ground you never confirmed the association owned." He let that hang. And then you issued a written trespass warning to the record title holder of that ground, accusing him of trespassing for standing on his own property. Nobody said anything. The air handler came on. Evelyn looked at the whiteboard. I had gone into that meeting with one more envelope, and this was the moment for it. I slid it across to Graham rather than to her because it was a legal instrument and it deserved a lawyer's hands. Inside was a notice of encroachment, prepared by my attorney, who has been handling my family's property matters for 9 years and who has the temperament of a scalpel. It was 3 pages and it was scrupulously polite. It identified my parcel by deed book and page. It attached Miles Corbin's sealed survey. It recited the easement and its limits, and it recited the expired license, and it stated that the association's structures constituted a continuing encroachment upon my property, and that I demanded within 30 days that the association do 5 things. Remove or relocate the gate assembly and its stone pillars. Remove or relocate the surveillance camera and its post. Remove or relocate the monument signage and ornamental fencing. Restore the ground disturbed by the footings and foundations to its prior grade and condition, and address the electrical conduit running beneath my parcel either by relocation or by a properly negotiated and recorded utility easement at the association's option. And then there was the 6th paragraph, and the 6th paragraph is the one I care about most, and it is the reason I can still look at myself in a mirror. The notice expressly affirmed that the recorded access easement of 1997 remained in full force and effect and would be honored without interference. Every resident of Briar Glen would continue to have unobstructed vehicular and pedestrian passage. So would fire apparatus, ambulances, the school bus, the mail carrier, the trash service, and every delivery driver in the county. I was not going to close a road. I was not going to trap 222 households behind a legal maneuver because one woman on their board had decided she could read my worth off my truck and my hands. That would have made me into something I have spent my whole life declining to become. Evelyn read the notice over Graham's shoulder and stood up out of her chair. You're trying to take our gate. No, ma'am, I said. I don't want your gate. I want it off my land. Those are 2 entirely different sentences, and the difference between them is about 40 feet. Then I reached into my folder and took out one more piece of paper, the cream-colored one with the embossed letterhead, and I laid it flat on the table and turned it around so it faced her. 2 weeks ago you sent me this, I said. It says I was trespassing when I stopped my truck on that gravel. It says I obstructed the entrance and threatened you. I put my finger on Miles's survey, on the bold red boundary line running behind both stone pillars. The gravel I was standing on is inside this line. The pillar you were standing in front of when you told me people like me don't park here is inside this line, so I'd like to ask my question again, and I'd like the answer to go in the minutes. Who is standing on whose property? Not one member of that board said a word in her defense. Diane Foster took her reading glasses out of her hair and put them on and pulled the survey toward herself, and that was the only movement in the room. What happened over the following 2 weeks happened mostly without me, which is how I preferred it. Graham Talbot did what a competent attorney does when he discovers his client is standing in a hole. He stopped digging and started measuring. He wrote a memorandum to the full board, and I later saw a redacted copy of it, and it laid out the exposure with no cushioning whatsoever. If the association litigated and lost, and Graham's assessment was that it would lose, the association would face the cost of removing and rebuilding the entire entrance assembly, estimated between $60,000 and $90,000. Survey costs, both mine and their own. Restoration and landscaping of the disturbed ground. Attorney's fees for both sides since my notice preserved a claim for them, and a claim for the reasonable value of 6 years of unauthorized occupation of private land after the expiration of a written license. A claim that was not enormous but was not zero, and which had the ugly quality of being extremely easy to prove because the association had signed the license itself. Then Graham added the paragraph that ended Evelyn Strickland's presidency. He noted that the 2018 capital improvement had been approved and funded from association reserves for construction upon land the association did not own and had, by its own recorded agreement, acknowledged it did not own, which raised questions of fiduciary care that the board would need to address independent of the boundary dispute itself. Diane Foster addressed them. She went into the minute books. She found in the archive of association correspondence from June of 2018 an email chain. Maureen Reddick's attorney to the association's then president forwarded to the incoming board subject line referencing the temporary land license and the need to identify a relocation site for the entrance before expiration. It had been forwarded in November of 2019 to Evelyn Strickland 4 months after she took the chair. There was no reply. There was no follow-up. There was no item in any subsequent agenda. There was, however, in the minutes of the March 2020 meeting, a line noting that the president had reviewed historical entrance documentation and confirmed no outstanding obligations. That single line is what turned a mistake into negligence. A person who never knew is careless. A person who was told and looked and wrote down that there was nothing to look at is something else. Evelyn came to see me one last time before the special meeting. She came alone on a Tuesday evening, and this time she came up the driveway and stood at the bottom of my porch steps, and she looked older than she had at the gate. There was no board behind her now. There was no room to perform to. "I think this has gotten out of proportion," she said. "The gate has been there for 30 years. It doesn't harm you. If you'd let it stay where it is, we could put all of this behind us. I'd see to it the notice is withdrawn and nothing further is pursued." I stayed where I was, up on the porch with my coffee. "Withdrawn," I repeated. "You mean the trespass warning?" "Yes." "So I forget that one." She didn't answer. "And do I forget the meeting?" I asked. "The one where you stood me up in front of 30 of your neighbors and wouldn't say my name, where you told me I wasn't familiar with how communities like yours operate?" She looked at the porch rail. "That was not intended the way you took it." "Ma'am," I said, "I've been taking sentences that way since I was 9 years old, and I've gotten very good at it. But I'll tell you what actually matters here, and it isn't my feelings." I set the cup down on the rail. "You didn't decide I was in the wrong place because you'd checked. You decided it, and then you never checked. And the reason you never checked is that you didn't think a man who looked like me standing next to a truck full of fence pickets could possibly have a claim worth verifying. And then you spent association money and association authority acting on that. You don't have to like me, you don't have to invite me anywhere, but you don't get to use a homeowners association to decide who deserves to stand on their own land." She stood there a moment longer. Then she said, "Good evening, Mr. Reddick," and walked back down my driveway, and that was the last full conversation I ever had with her. The special meeting was held on a Tuesday in the middle of May in the same clubhouse, and this time there were closer to 140 people in the room, and folding chairs down both side walls. Evelyn did not chair it. Diane Foster chaired it. Evelyn sat at the end of the table in the seat nearest the wall, and I want to be clear that I took no pleasure in seeing where she was sitting, because a room that turns is a frightening thing to watch regardless of who it turns on. Graham Talbot presented. He put Miles Corbin's sealed survey up on a projector screen at the front of the room, 6 feet wide, and the red boundary line ran across it and passed directly through both stone pillars. Behind the control cabinet, a camera post behind the monument sign, he walked the residents through it slowly because he understood what he was doing. He was making 140 people see it with their own eyes so that nobody could later claim they'd been told a story. And then he said the sentence, and he said it in that flat lawyer's cadence that somehow makes things land harder. "The gate structure is located on Mr. Reddick's property." I want to hold on that for a moment because I have thought about it many times since. The gate. The one with the brass plate and the gold leaf lettering and the camera that reads license plates and decides who belongs. The gate that a woman had stood in front of with her arms folded to inform me that my home was certainly not behind it, that people like me had no business there, that I should stay off association property. That gate had been standing on my dirt the entire time. Every day she drove through it, every time she pointed at it, every word of that trespass warning, the whole apparatus she used to prove I was an outsider had been resting for 6 years past the expiration of a license my own family granted her, on ground that belonged to me. Somebody in the third row said out loud, "Oh, for God's sake, Evelyn." The votes came one after another. The board formally rescinded the trespass warning and entered the rescission in the record. It approved reimbursement of my survey costs as reasonable and necessary. It authorized Graham to negotiate a relocation agreement with my council, moving the entire gate to a position wholly within association-owned land at the head of the interior street, with the association bearing all costs and with restoration of my disturbed ground to be performed by a contractor I approved. It adopted a new policy requiring documented title verification before any capital improvement involving land, and it adopted a code of conduct governing how board members may address residents, non-member neighbors, and adjacent landowners with a complaint procedure attached. Then Diane Foster moved to remove Evelyn Strickland from the office of president. The motion carried. It was not close, and it was not loud, and nobody cheered, which I thought spoke well of them. Evelyn gathered her folder in her handbag and left before the meeting adjourned, and the room let her go without comment. Her defeat wasn't that anyone humiliated her. It was that a room she had controlled for 7 years simply stopped believing her, all at once, in about 90 seconds, and there was nothing in her toolkit for that. They rebuilt the entrance in July. It took a crew 9 days. They cut the pillars off their footings and lifted them with a small crane onto a flatbed, and they broke out the concrete pads as they pulled the conduit and retrenched it inside the association's own ground. The new gate sits about 110 feet further in, at the top of the rise where the interior street begins, and I'll admit it looks better there. It's got a proper turnaround, and the sight lines are cleaner, and the county fire marshal was happier with the approach than he'd ever been with the old one. I stood at my fence line on the last morning and watched the second pillar come off the ground. There was a rectangle of pale, compacted dirt where it had been and a raw ring of clay around it, and it looked like nothing at all, like a place where a thing used to be. I didn't take a picture, I didn't call anybody. I drank my coffee and I watched, and then I went and finished the cedar fence I'd been building since March, which had been sitting half done in my side yard that entire time because life has a way of interrupting projects. Miles Corbin came out at the end of the month to verify the final positions and set the permanent monuments. He walked the line with the rover, made his notes, drove 2 brass-capped pins, and then stood with me for a minute looking at the fresh sod where the entrance island used to be. "Everything's where it's supposed to be now," he said. "It always should have been," I said. He nodded, packed his gear, and left. He billed me for 2 hours. Evelyn still lives in Briar Glen. She drives past my road most mornings, and about a week after the new gate opened, she slowed as she passed my driveway and looked at me while I was pulling my trash bin back up. She didn't stop. I didn't wave her down. There was nothing left to say, and I have never been interested in being feared by anybody. That isn't what any of this was about. What it was about was a woman who looked at my skin, and my truck, and the dirt on my clothes, and decided in less than 4 seconds that she already knew everything worth knowing about me, including where I did and did not have the right to stand. She was wrong. And the thing is, she could have found out she was wrong at any point at almost no cost on any of about 200 days when a single phone call to a title company would have settled it. She never made that call, because to make it she would have had to entertain the possibility that the answer might not flatter her. Her greatest mistake was never that she underestimated me. People have underestimated me my whole life, and most of the time it costs them nothing and costs me a little. Her mistake was that she stood on my property and told me I had no right to be there. Evelyn Strickland once stood in front of that gate and told me that a man like me didn't belong here. In the end, she was only half right. I really don't belong to her homeowners association, and I never wanted to, but the gate belonged to my land.